Have you ever wondered what truly happens when the hospital halls grow silent and the lights dim in the dead of night? You know those late-night whispers, the eerie creaks, and the distant sounds that echo through the empty corridors. What if I told you they weren't just figments of the imagination? What if I told you that hospitals, places where life and death intersect daily, carry more than just memories of the living? There are some things that linger. This story is personal, and it still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. It's about my night shift at a hospital where something far more sinister than medical emergencies occurred. Something I wasn't prepared for. Are you ready to hear the tale of the haunted hospital? It was a rainy Thursday night, and I had just clocked in for the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. The place had always felt eerie to me after dark, but nothing like what I was about to experience. As a nurse, I was used to the silence of the late hours. The hallways, typically bustling during the day, would fall unnervingly still, save for the occasional call button from a patient or a distant beeping from the monitors. But that night was different. There was an unusual heaviness in the air, as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. I thought I was just tired and brushed it off as exhaustion. After all, this was a hospital. What could really go wrong? At 11:45 p.m. the ward was mostly quiet. Most of the patients were either asleep or too weak to stir. The flickering fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed lightly, and the faint hum of medical equipment created a dull background noise. I was in charge of the 4th floor, the palliative care unit, where patients in the last stages of life stayed. It wasn't uncommon for the energy on that floor to feel heavy, but tonight it was oppressive. As I made my rounds, checking vitals and medications, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe the storm outside, or maybe the way shadows seemed to stretch further than usual down the hallway. But my stomach was tight, and my hands had started to tremble. Around 1:30 a.m., I was finishing up with one of my last patients for the night. Mr. Peterson, an elderly man in his 80s, had been declining rapidly. His breaths were shallow and his pulse weak. I adjusted his IV and made sure he was comfortable. As I stepped out of his room, the hall was darker than usual. The lights that usually lined the walls seemed dimmer, casting long, shadowy streaks on the floor. As I walked toward the nurse's station, I caught something moving out of the corner of my eye. I stopped, heart pounding, and turned to face one of the empty rooms at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, though I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no one in that room, no patient, no visitors. I walked slowly toward the room, my pulse quickening with each step. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound piercing the silence. The room was empty, just as I expected. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, fear seizing my chest. The air around me felt thick, like something unseen was pressing in from all sides. I wanted to turn around to see what was behind me, but I was too scared to move. My throat tightened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to take a breath, to swallow the rising panic. When I finally turned, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. Shaken, I hurried back to the nurse's station, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. I hadn't slept well the night before. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had followed me down that hallway, and whatever it wasn't human. Around 3 a.m., I was getting a patient file from the records room, which was located in the basement. The basement was notorious among the staff. No one liked going down there, especially at night. It was cold, damp, and dimly lit. Some of the staff joked about the basement being haunted, but I never paid much attention to the stories. That night, though, something changed. As I pressed the button for the elevator and waited, I heard the unmistakable sound of children laughing, soft, high-pitched giggles. Confused, I looked around. There were no children on this floor, especially not at this hour. The 4th floor was for adult palliative care only. The elevator doors opened with a low groan, and I stepped inside, still uneasy from what I'd just heard. I pressed the button for the basement and watched the doors slowly close. Just as they were about to shut, I saw something, a flash of movement. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a small child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing in the hallway, staring at me. She wore a hospital gown, her hair matted, her skin pale and lifeless. The doors shut before I could react, and the elevator began its descent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the rail tightly, trying to steady my nerves. Had I really seen her? There were no children on this floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Was it a patient's family member? But no, she had been too still, too silent. The elevator jerked to a stop at the basement, and as the doors opened, I felt the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. The cold air hit me like a wave, and as I stepped out, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. My breath came in shallow gasps as I quickly grabbed the file I needed and rushed back to the elevator. When the doors finally closed again, I pressed the button for the 4th floor, desperate to leave the basement. But before the elevator could start moving, I felt it. The unmistakable chill of someone standing right next to me. I didn't want to look. I couldn't. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw her again. The same little girl standing motionless, her empty eyes staring up at me. I pressed the button for the 4th floor over and over again, my hand shaking as I begged the elevator to move. When it finally started, I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to look at the girl, praying that she would be gone by the time the doors opened. When I finally reached the 4th floor, I bolted out of the elevator, my legs trembling. I never looked back. By 4:15 a.m., I was doing my best to focus on my duties and ignore the gnawing fear in my gut. The ward was quiet again, and I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination. Hospitals are creepy at night, especially when you're tired. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Then came the strangest occurrence of the night. As I passed Mr. Peterson's room again, I saw that his bed was empty. I froze. Just moments ago, I had checked on him. He had been there, barely clinging to life. My pulse quickened, and I rushed inside, thinking maybe he had fallen out of bed or tried to get up. But there was no sign of him. I checked the bathroom, the closets, everywhere. No Mr. Peterson. He was gone. I sprinted back to the nurse's station, frantically checking the patient log. There was no record of him being discharged, no note from any other nurse or doctor. He had simply vanished. Panicking, I called security, fearing the worst. Maybe he had wandered off, confused in the night. But as they reviewed the security footage, my blood ran cold. There was no sign of him leaving the room. In fact, the footage showed me entering and leaving his room several times, but Mr. Peterson never appeared on the tape. His bed was empty in every frame. It was as if he had never existed. The rest of the night passed in a blur of confusion and fear. By the time the morning shift arrived, I was a mess, physically and emotionally. I told my colleagues what had happened, but they just gave me sympathetic smiles, saying it was probably stress. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. That day I went to the hospital records to find out more about Mr. Peterson, hoping to make sense of what had happened. When I pulled his file, my heart nearly stopped. His admission date was listed as 2 weeks prior, but there was something else, something that made my blood turn to ice. Mr. Peterson had died the night before I ever met him. His death had been recorded at 2 a.m., and yet I had spoken to him, checked his vitals, and cared for him well past that time. But according to the records, he had been gone long before I'd ever entered his room. Even now, I can't explain what happened during that night shift. The little girl in the elevator, the disappearing patient, the footsteps behind.